Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a look at something that just came out of Washington, an executive order that President Trump signed on March 20th of this year, 2025. Mm-hmm. It's all about, shaking things up in how the government buys stuff,
Right.
common goods and services.
Yeah.
The idea they're putting forward is that it's going to, boost efficiency and cut back on waste, which
Oh,
always sounds good.
Always good.
But, the devil's in the details, right?
Exactly. And to really dig into that, we've got a great piece here, an opinion piece from Yahoo News by Kevin J. Allis,
Yeah.
published just a few days later on March 24th, 2025.
This piece really caught my eye because it looks at this executive order and thinks about, okay, what's this going to mean for folks who may not be at the top of mind when these things are being written and signed.
Right.
And in this case, he's
Yeah.
talking about tribal businesses and, specifically how they work with the Small Business Administration's 8A program. So for everyone listening in today, we're going to kind of try to unpack that. What could this change mean for the economic self-reliance of Native communities?
Yeah, it's a really crucial question. And to understand where we might be going, it's helpful to take a look at where we are now and really grasp the power of this 8A program.
Right. So let's break down this 8 program, particularly as it applies to tribally owned businesses. What's the big benefit here?
Well, think of the 8A program as kind of this really vital tool that helps tribal nations build economic self-sufficiency.
Okay.
It gives them this dedicated pathway to access all these federal contracting opportunities. And one thing Kevin Allis really highlights is this really key feature, the ability for these businesses to get sole source awards under certain conditions.
Okay.
Which basically means they can be awarded contracts directly without having to go through this whole open competitive bidding process.
So it's not just about being allowed to bid, it's about creating a system that recognizes their unique position and lets them directly engage with the government in some situations.
Exactly.
That's pretty big.
Yeah, it really is.
So what kind of positive changes have we seen because of this program?
Oh, it's had a huge impact.
Yeah.
These 8A businesses, they become real economic drivers in their tribal communities.
Oh, I bet.
It creates jobs for tribal members, which is massive. And the revenue that's generated often funds really essential tribal services, things like healthcare, education, infrastructure, really vital stuff.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's about giving Native communities the power to build their own economic future, a more secure and independent one. These aren't just businesses. They're really the foundation for self-determination.
That really highlights how important this program is.
Mm-hmm.
But now let's turn to this executive order, the potential for some rough waters ahead for these tribal businesses. How could this really shake things up?
Well, the biggest change is this move to put the General Services Administration, the GSA, in charge of buying pretty much all common goods and services.
All right.
The order says it's all about efficiency and cutting waste.
Right.
But the opinion piece you flagged raises some serious red flags for Tribal A firms.
Like, what are the biggest worries right off the bat?
Well, one big concern is that individual agencies might lose some of their ability to directly award contracts.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Tribal 8A firms have these strong, long-standing relationships with certain agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Those agencies have really come to understand what they bring to the table, not just the products or services, but, the deep connection to the community.
Right, right.
If everything goes through the GSA, you kind of lose those direct lines of communication and contracting.
So instead of working directly with an agency that really knows their strengths, it's more like being thrown into this massive impersonal system.
Exactly.
And that shift could make things a lot harder for them.
Yeah, and it raises the risk of these tribal businesses getting lost in the shuffle. The GSA has these huge, complex contracting mechanisms that are set up to deal with all sorts of contractors, and those might not work very well for smaller tribal businesses.
Right.
The push for efficiency often leads to these big contracts and standardized processes, which can actually overlook the unique benefits of those sole source contracts with tribal entities. The localized economic development, the cultural preservation.
I see.
Those are things that get lost in the bigger picture.
And Kevin Allis really zeroes in on the challenges this could create for smaller or newer tribal businesses.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific hurdles they might face with this GSA-centric approach?
Well, there are a few. Getting on GSA schedules or getting into these government-wide acquisition contracts, GWACs.
Right.
Those are like these pre-negotiated contracts that multiple agencies can use.
Right.
But to do that, you often need a really solid track record. You need a certain level of infrastructure and a lot of administrative capacity.
Mm-hmm.
These can be tough for tribal enterprises, especially those in rural or reservation areas where resources might be more limited.
I bet.
Even applying to get on these GSA vehicles can be complicated and time-consuming. It's a barrier to entry.
It almost sounds like the whole structure of GSA contracting is unintentionally making it tougher for these businesses to compete.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe the biggest concern for the Tribal 8A program is what happens to the sole source contract authority.
Right, we talked about how important that is earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It seems especially vulnerable under this new order. Can you explain why?
Well, if federal buyers are basically told or even required to mainly use GSA-managed contracts,
Mm.
you know,
Mm.
giving a sole source contract directly to a Tribal 8A firm might not seem as attractive, or it might even be discouraged.
I see.
The focus shifts to competition within the GSA framework, and that could really undermine the very thing that's helped tribal businesses get a foothold and build their capacity in the federal marketplace.
Right.
That's a core part of how the 8A program has worked for tribes.
So navigating the GSA is its own challenge, and this really important sole source option could end up getting sidelined.
Right.
What are some specific things that make engaging with GSA contracting mechanisms difficult for tribal firms?
Well, on top of just getting on those schedules and into those GWCs,
Mm.
there's a whole lot of paperwork and red tape.
Oh,
Staying compliant with GSA regulations, dealing with any changes to the contracts, it's a lot of administrative burden.
makes sense.
And Kevin Allis points out that proving you have enough past performance can be really hard for newer companies.
Yeah.
And sometimes, if you're in a remote area, infrastructure limitations can make it hard to meet certain technological or logistical requirements that are in GSA contracts.
Right.
And just the sheer volume of administrative work can be a huge strain for smaller organizations that don't have a lot of staff.
It sounds like the system, while trying to be efficient overall, might not really be set up to understand or accommodate the unique situations and strengths of a lot of tribal businesses.
You hit the nail on the head, and that's why this sole source authority is so important.
Can you remind us again why being able to contract directly is so crucial for tribal economic independence?
Absolutely.
And for our listeners, too.
Yeah.
Why is that direct contracting ability so important?
It gives tribal businesses this really vital chance to build a solid foundation. They can gain experience, build capacity, establish a good track record without having to immediately go up against these giant companies in the open market.
Right.
It's like a stepping stone that's absolutely crucial for them to become sustainable in the long run and for tribal nations to achieve real economic self-determination.
Right.
If you take that away, it could really hurt their progress.
That makes a lot of sense. The opinion piece also talks about how urgent this is and calls for taking action. What are some of the solutions that are being proposed to tackle these challenges?
Well, the message is pretty clear. The GSA and the administration need to really listen to Native communities as they put this executive order into practice.
Okay.
There are a few key ideas being put forward. One big one is setting aside specific slots for tribal businesses within those GSA contract vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of making them compete in this huge general pool, there would be some opportunities specifically for them.
That sounds like a much fairer approach. What else is being talked about?
Making sure that tribal 8A firms don't lose that sole source authority is absolutely essential.
Right.
Advocates are pushing hard for this to stay a real and easy option for federal agencies, even with this new centralized system.
Okay.
Beyond that, making it easier for tribal businesses to get involved in centralized procurement is key.
Yeah.
Streamlining the onboarding process and taking into account the challenges these firms often face.
So making it less bureaucratic to get into the system in the first place.
Right. And another important piece is capacity building support.
Okay.
This could mean giving them targeted resources and technical assistance to help them meet those GSA requirements.
That makes sense.
Teaming up with institutions like the 1862 land-grant universities or national tribal organizations could be a big help with that.
So it sounds like a really well-rounded approach is needed to make sure tribal businesses aren't accidentally put at a disadvantage by this policy change.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, as Kevin Allis does point out, that there's also potential for good to come out of this.
Oh.
If they really focus on equity and inclusion as they design this new system, it could actually give tribal businesses more visibility and even open up more diverse opportunities for them.
So streamlining isn't bad in itself, but the key is how it's done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The danger is in having a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't consider the unique context and the needs and the contributions of these tribal businesses.
Right.
That's why it's so important to get involved now and make sure their voices are heard.
Absolutely. As agencies start changing their buying strategies because of this executive order, Tribal nations and their economic development groups need to speak up and make sure their concerns are addressed.
Right.
The piece really emphasizes a key message that's being sent to Congress, the SBA, the GSA, and the White House. What's the bottom line?
The message is, don't leave Indian country behind in the name of efficiency.
Powerful.
Yeah, trying to make things more efficient and cut waste shouldn't come at the expense of a program that's been so vital for economic self-sufficiency in Native communities. It's not about asking for special treatment. It's about asking for a fair chance to compete in this new system. Tribal businesses have the skills and the drive, but the system needs to be set up in a way that lets them succeed.
This has been a really insightful look at what could be a really significant policy shift and all the different ways it could play out. As we wrap up our deep dive today, what are the biggest takeaways for you?
Well, I think the key thing is this tension between trying to make federal procurement more efficient and the potential for that to hurt a program that's really important for tribal economic self-sufficiency. It shows just how complicated federal procurement can be and how important it is to really understand the specific needs and strengths of tribal enterprises.
And for everyone listening out there, as you think about everything we've talked about today, I'd encourage you to think about how these big policy changes affect different communities.
Yeah.
How can we make sure that when we try to make things more efficient, we're also making sure that everyone has a fair shot at the opportunities that are out there?
This situation really makes you think about how the government creates and carries out its initiatives.
Right.
And who really gets a seat at the table when these big decisions are being made.
Definitely.
It's a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.